32, Section 1. And it's called the Nixon Administration. We're going to be talking about how President Richard Nixon tried to steer the country in a more conservative direction. That means away from federal control, more limited, localized government, but also how Nixon as a Republican is different than even what a Republican might mean today. So we're going to talk about some of his domestic, economic, and foreign policy decisions.
When Richard Nixon was running for president in 1968, a war was being fought in the jungles of Vietnam. Protesters were filling the streets at home, and many people wished we could go back to a simpler time. Like the 50s.
Dig it, Daddy-O.
In the 1950s, Nixon had served as vice president under Dwight Eisenhower. Nixon's experience made him seem like the perfect choice to restore the peace and prosperity of the Eisenhower years. In 1968, at the height of the war, Nixon pledged to
bring an honorable end to the war in Vietnam.
And that was an offer America couldn't refuse.
Richard Nixon was elected because of the Vietnam War. He promised that he would end it. He, in fact, extended it.
Nixon figured a peaceful chat with the North Vietnamese might clear up some misunderstandings. Unfortunately, the North Vietnamese disagreed, and Nixon tried to end the conflict the old-fashioned way. When increased bombings failed to end the war, Nixon got back on the peace train. He negotiated a ceasefire with North Vietnam, ending America's involvement in the war at last. Ending war seemed to be Nixon's special talent, so now he turned his efforts toward the ongoing war against communism. His attempts to end the Cold War sent him out to the two biggest battlefields, China and the USSR.
Richard Nixon, a lifelong anti-communist, went to what used to be called Red China because his vision extended far enough to realize that it was in the interest of the world, the Chinese and the United States, for China to come out of its self-imposed isolation.
Peacemaking may be serious business, but it's not all talks, translators, and state dinners. The game of ping-pong diplomacy was on. When members of the U.S. and Chinese teams visited one another's countries and played a few matches, helping to ease tensions and open talks between their governments. The Soviets weren't invited to the ping-pong party, but they took it with a grain of salt. SALT stood for the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, signed by President Nixon and the leader of the Soviet Union, Leonid Brezhnev. The treaty called for the United States and the USSR to stop making nuclear weapons for 5 years. Great news! All aboard the peace train. Of course, both countries still had a pretty impressive collection of weapons, but Nixon's diplomatic skills had definitely helped thaw the Cold War. Nixon was re-elected in a landslide victory. But just when the stuffy guy in the suit and tie had convinced the world to give peace a chance, along came a little thing called Watergate.
Watergate, in which he helped conceal a criminal conspiracy, brought him down. And he's the only president of the United States to have had to resign his office.
During the 1972 presidential campaign, 5 men were caught burglarizing the Democratic Party headquarters in the Watergate office complex. They worked for Nixon and were looking for inside information about the Democrats that could help Nixon win his re-election. This was decidedly unpresidential behavior, and it just got worse. Further investigation by news reporters revealed campaign fraud, illegal wiretapping, and a secret fund to pay people off. Not exactly the kind of thing an honest 50s-style president should be doing. The U.S. Senate looked into the accusations, and former staff members testified that audio tapes existed of Nixon planning to cover up the break-in. Bad news for Nixon, since covering up a crime is also a crime.
Well, I'm not a crook. I've burned everything I've got.
The president fought back against the scandal, but there was only one way to make peace with an angry nation.
I have concluded that because of the Watergate matter, I might not have the support of the Congress that I would consider necessary to back the very difficult decisions and carry out the duties of this office in the way the interests of the nation will require. Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
The president works for the people, and one of the great tragedies of many recent presidents is that they thought they didn't have to tell the truth to the public. And the cover-ups, the concealment, the lies, the half-truths have, in the end, presidents who I believe wanted to do good wound up destroying themselves.
Nixon did a lot of great things as president. He got pretty far on that peace train and was a dedicated public servant. But after the Watergate scandal, he became the first president ever to resign the office. After that, having good feelings about Richard Nixon's presidency became a bit trickier.
How do you like me now?
All right, so Richard Nixon called himself a new conservative. And let's talk about what that means. First off, as a conservative, the typical strategy is to seek to decrease the size and influence of the federal government. And Nixon certainly intended to do that. But he meant to do that not through a reduction of taxes or a decrease of services. He meant to do that by giving the states more of the federal budget and allowing them to decide for themselves. It was also called the New Federalism. You know, federalism as a term that means dividing power between the states and the federal government. Nixon just simply sought to give the states more power. And so he did this through revenue sharing, meaning that the state of North Carolina has a certain amount of its budget, its operating budget, that comes directly from the federal government that it has the right to decide what to do with. But as a new conservative, he's a 1960s conservative. That meant that really he would be a Democrat today. For example, Nixon suggested that the federal government provide every American family with a base income. A base income. That means no matter what, each American family would receive a certain amount of money each year. The theory being that no family would have to starve, regardless of how much money they make. That's very liberal, at least by today's standards. In fact, most of the Senate, especially conservatives in the legislature, defeated this bill. But it was Nixon, a Republican, that introduced it. So this new federalism, on one hand, he backed many social spending measures like the Family Assistance Plan. But on the other, he tried to dismantle funding for others. But Nixon also ran on two main promises. Number one was to end the war in Vietnam with honor. We'll talk about that later, but to end the war in Vietnam with honor. Secondly, to restore law and order, meaning to put an end to the protest movements, to put an end to the divisiveness in our country, the riots, the demonstrations, and so forth. But the way that he's going to seek to do that is rather sneaky. Because like Peter Jennings was saying in the previous clip, that the way that modern presidents carry out their policies is so sneaky and dishonest that almost the very system itself corrupts these people. He used illegal tactics, spying on various social leaders, sometimes having them arrested without good cause even. But as a politician, Nixon was very capable. He knew that to win the presidency, he had to get the southern states. And he also knew that southern states were turning Republican, or at least turning away from the Democratic Party over the issue of segregation. This trend began with FDR, continued with Truman, and is partly responsible for the elections of Eisenhower and the political defeat of many of his opponents. He called it the Southern strategy, that if he appealed to the dislike in the southern states of segregation, of desegregation, then he could get those votes. Now, the really sneaky thing is here's how he did it. So the Supreme Court ordered in Brown v. Board that schools must be desegregated. But who enforces the law? It's the president. So if the president doesn't enforce a ruling, well, it doesn't get done. And remember, that was Eisenhower's response until the Little Rock Nine forced his hand. This is how Nixon is going to try to play it, just to slow down the process of desegregation. You know, for example, when the Voting Rights Act was to be extended to all states, Nixon actually opposed this because it was going to end literacy tests. He argued that it was taking away too much state control. And even though his veto was overridden, even though the Supreme Court ordered that the president had to comply with Brown v. Board, it still sent a strong message. You know, so for example, Charlotte-Mecklenburg Public Schools versus the United States Supreme Court, the Supreme Court ruled that school buses could be used to desegregate schools. You know, this was a really sneaky way that places like Charlotte and other places were getting around desegregation. They said, look, your family has always been zoned to go to this school. Period. That's your school. That's where the bus will take you. And so, for many families, buses are their only form of transportation for their kids, so they went to that school. And that's how segregation was perpetuated. But the Supreme Court authorized the federal government to allow buses to go anywhere. You know, some of you guys are being bused from other parts of the county to this school. Some of you guys spend an hour at least on the bus every day because you have the right to attend the school of your choice, and the government has the responsibility to provide that transportation for you. So, how did Nixon try to get around this? Well, like others, appointing chief justices who he believed were sympathetic to his cause. Now, in regards to the economy, you know, in civics economics, you're going to learn the basics of supply and demand and how this rule allows economists to predict the health and wealth and stability of our economy. Because it's a known fact that if people make lots of money, what are they going to do with it? They're going to spend it. And if lots of people make lots of money, what are they going to do with it? They're going to spend lots of money. Well, what does that do to the prices of goods? If everybody wants the new thing's really expensive. When sales for the new thing decline, prices go down. You know, that's why you see price drops on video game systems after about a year. Why? Because demand for it goes down. You know, if you really want the new phone but can't afford it, if you can wait a year, that new phone is still going to work just fine. I promise you, it will work just fine. But it will be almost half priced if you can just wait a year. And that's a big deal. Okay, so what happens if the amount of money that people make go down, but prices continue to go up? Guys, the law of supply and demand can sometimes be broken. It doesn't make sense, but it can. And here's why. Well, number one, unemployment was going up because many jobs were going overseas. Many jobs were going overseas. What? Like t-shirts. Why make a t-shirt in America when you can do it for a fraction of the cost in Malaysia? Or any basic manufacturing. Or even the harvesting of raw materials. Why get those things from here? You know, we bought a lawnmower over spring break. It says, made in America, but then in subtext it says, all the parts came from somewhere else. Yeah. All they did, someone assembled the parts here. Yay, good for them. But the parts came from somewhere else. Why? Because it's cheaper. So unemployment was going up, largely due to international trade, but prices were also going up, partly because of the Vietnam War, partly because of the decline in social programs, but also because of rising oil prices. Oil prices tripled during the 1970s. Tripled. And so, again, that's leading to rising inflation. All this is caused by stagflation. So what can you do about this? Not much. From the 1970s forward, we boosted domestic oil production. That's helped some. It's helped to stabilize oil prices. In regards to the economy has begun to adjust. You're not going into the textile industry because that's a dying industry. You're not going into coal because that's a dying industry. You're probably not going into transportation because soon that will be a dying industry. What else are we going into? Technology, the service sector. Again, our economy is beginning to adjust. But my favorite aspect of Nixon is his willingness to practice realpolitik. And so if you're a fan of Machiavelli's The Prince, if you haven't read it, you should. I've got a copy. Realpolitik means that we don't need to elect the nice guy. Nice guys don't make good leaders. Machiavelli even said that a leader needs to appear to be good, but be prepared to do evil. The Dark Knight was not the hero Gotham wanted. He was the hero Gotham needed. No one wanted to be that guy to drop the atomic bomb and kill babies. But Truman believed that it needed to be done. And so we had a president who authorized the killing of babies. Realpolitik means that foreign policy doesn't come down to right and wrong. That's not how you play the game. Foreign policy is about power. And on the subject of power, Machiavelli said that leaders are ones who are consumed with gaining power and keeping power by any means necessary. And that power itself is the end goal. And so, in doing so, Nixon followed a policy of détente. And I'll explain. When China fell to the communists in 1947, America was shocked. Oh my gosh, not only is the largest country in the world in regards to area a communist nation, the Soviet Union, but now the most populated nation in the world is communist. Oh my gosh. And we cut off relations with China. We called it the bad place. So China was cut off, and we had no relationship with them. Until, guess who goes to visit China? Richard Nixon. So we were calling China oppressive. They had committed numerous human rights violations. They had no free press. They had no free speech. Their people were subjects and not citizens. And then Nixon went and shook hands with them and invited their ping pong team to come over, and their leader came over. So he went to hell, and he worked out a trade deal with the devil. And it was good for everybody, because trade is great, and now your iPhones are made there, partly thanks to Nixon. But he took it a step further. So if China is hell, the Soviet Union's super hell. And Nixon went there too. And he made a deal with the premier of the Soviet Union. He was like, look, us threatening to blow each other up all the time is not good for business. What do we ultimately care about? Business. Let's put aside the stupid Cold War. I'm going to not try to stop communism. I'm going to end. Guess who ended the war in Vietnam? Guess who signed the SALT Treaty? Guess who opened relations with China? Are those bad places? Yes. Did he care? No. So he went to hell. He shook hands with the devil. And now the devil makes your iPhones. Go figure. Okay.